Jordanians are crushed. I mean, morale among the Egyptian army and the Jordanian army may be at a historic low. Back in 1956, the Israelis initiated what we now call the Suez crisis by invading Egypt. Egypt had closed several key shipping lanes to Israeli commerce, Israeli ships. So the Suez Canal, of course, but also the Strait of Tiran. So Israel was developing a new port there in the northern end of the Gulf of Aqaba. Of course, the only way to get supplies to and from this new port was through the Strait of Tiran, down there by Sharm el-Sheikh. And now Egypt had closed it off. So these are supposed to be peaceful international shipping lanes where maritime activities free for all, but they're closed. So Israel essentially blockaded in that sense and invades Egypt right here across the Sinai. And then Britain and France jump in, as you probably know. And in the end, these parties are made to back down in part by the United States and to a lesser degree the Soviet Union. But when the dust settles, the Suez Canal and the Strait of Tiran are opened again to Israeli commerce. UN peacekeepers are sent here to the Sinai, Sharm el-Sheikh, and other locations to keep those sea lanes open, but also hopefully to prevent the outbreak of war between Egypt and Israel. But relations deteriorate anyway over the next few years between Egypt and Israel. And it's not just between Egypt and Israel, between Israel and its other Arab neighbors. When you see fighters from Jordan battling Israeli police and military in the Old City, in the West Bank, you see Syrian fighters skirmishing with Israeli forces fairly frequently. And then in 1966, Egypt makes a defense pact. Of course, this is Egypt under Nasser this whole time. Egypt under Nasser, the pan-Arabist. This is the height of pan-Arabism. There's something of an Arab consolidation going on, underscored by the 1966 Mutual Defense Pact between Egypt and Syria.
Two presidents, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt and Shukri al-Quwatli of Syria, meet to make history in Cairo with the federation of their two states into one, the United Arab Republic. The news electrified the entire Middle East. In Cairo, cheering throngs followed the two leaders through the streets exultantly. Al-Azhar Mosque is the scene of prayers for the new union, which has already invited all Arab states to join. One, Yemen, is expected to bid for inclusion. The new state numbers 30 million, largest in the Mideast. Nasser has set vast forces in motion with this act. The effect on the precariously balanced Middle East, no one today can prophesy. The rest of the world, America, Russia, Israel, all remain cautiously quiet, awaiting the events that will follow on Gamal Nasser's moment of triumph.
So now you have these two countries, essentially on either side of Israel, tying their military fates together. And so obviously for Israel, this is a little worrisome. Well, the next year, Egypt receives what turns out to be faulty intelligence from the Soviet Union that Israel is planning to attack Egypt. Of course, if Israel is going to attack Egypt, it would be through here, through the Sinai Peninsula. So Nasser begins amassing what really is the bulk of the Egyptian army. Hundreds of thousands of troops, hundreds and hundreds of warplanes, hundreds and hundreds of tanks on the Egyptian-Israeli border here in the Sinai. And they're fortifying the main roads they expect the Israelis will use across the Sinai. But that's what they're doing, amassing troops on the border. So of course, if you're Israel observing this, what are you going to think? Well, you might think that Egypt is preparing for an invasion. Nasser kicks out the UN peacekeepers, takes over their position at Sharm el-Sheikh, and closes the Strait of Tiran. So once again, there's at least a partial blockade on Israeli shipping. The Israelis have been hemmed in. And then about a week after closing the strait, which of course the Israelis have warned Nasser, if you do this, we'll see a repeat of 1956. We will respond, with force. But he does it anyway. Probably not the wisest course of action. But he's confident. He's confident in his military. This time around, it's going to be different. He's got his military alliance with Syria, the Mutual Defense Pact, and about a week after the closure of the strait, he hammers out a Mutual Defense Pact with Jordan. So now Egypt and Jordan are militarily tied. So now the Arab countries surrounding Israel are all tied together through military defense pacts. And they're all amassing troops on the border with Israel, not just Egypt. The Syrians are beginning to amass troops. The Jordanians are beginning to amass troops. The Jordanians are inviting the Iraqis to come in, and the Iraqis do it. Come in with troops, come in with tanks. They begin amassing on the Israeli border. So again, if you are Israel, what do you think about all this? So the Israeli leadership gets together and decides, this is on June 4th, decides to launch a preemptive war, anticipating an invasion of Israel. Rather than let them invade on their timetable, we will preemptively strike. And the Israelis have been practicing for just such an emergency, particularly their Air Force. But in any case, that's what they do the next day, June 5th, 1967. We see the beginning of a war that will change the face of the Middle East forever, and in some ways guide world history over the coming decades. The 6-Day War. Well, the first day of the war is a disaster for the Egyptians. In a matter of just a few hours, essentially in the morning, the Egyptian army is in shambles. Half of its air force is destroyed. Hundreds of its tanks are destroyed. And something like over 400 planes destroyed in just a few hours. The Israelis will later boast, in fact that day, they'll boast that never in military history have more planes been destroyed in so short a time. See, the Israelis have been practicing so that they can conduct, these Israeli pilots, multiple sorties a day, 3 or 4. The usual is 1 or 2, but they've got the come back, refit, refuel, and go back out down to an art. So they can do 3 or 4 a day. And what this does practically, obviously, is this doubles or triples the size of your Air Force. And so to this day, there persists rumors or theories among some Arabs that Israel could not have been the only attacker that day, that planes from other countries secretly were assisting Israel that day, because there's no way. That was just the Israeli Air Force. There had to have been help. No real evidence for that. The Israeli Air Force just dominated. And the Israeli push across the Sinai begins. Well, none of this stops President Nasser from announcing that Israel has been destroyed, that Egypt is winning. Okay, and this convinces King Hussein of Jordan to begin shelling Jerusalem, the Israeli part of Jerusalem, as well as other Israeli towns and villages and cities, including Tel Aviv. And so the shells begin to drop by the hundreds. And so Israeli forces respond, and despite the fact that early on the Jordanians were able to actually make headway, conquer some territory, by the end of the day they've been pushed back. The shells are still falling, but they've been pushed back. And Israeli leadership sees this as an opportunity. You started shelling us, well, now we're going to use this as our excuse to take the rest of Jerusalem, or as they would put it, to free the old city. And so that's how day one ends. The Egyptian military in shambles, the Israelis speeding across the Sinai, and despite the fact that shells are still dropping, the Israeli army poised to take the rest of Jerusalem from the Jordanians. Well, on June 6th, this is day 2 of the 6-Day War, the Israelis are able to conquer the towns and neighborhoods around Old Jerusalem. And by the end of the day, they've established positions even along the east of the Old City, so they've got it surrounded. This is a siege. They've got it surrounded so much so that the shelling from there ceases, and Israelis are able to sort of come out of their bomb shelters. Meanwhile, down in Gaza, where some of the shelling had originated as well, the Israeli Defense Forces launch an assault, and by the end of the day, Israel controls Gaza as well. So by day 2, you have the Old City besieged by the Israelis, and you have Gaza conquered. Well, Israeli successes continue to pile up on day 3, June 7th, 1967. This is the day that the Israelis take the Temple Mount. And, the brigadier commander there, radioing back emotionally, the Temple Mount is in our hands. And it's interesting to see what this means to so many Israelis. The so-called liberation of the Old City. For many Israelis, this is a return home. That's how they see it. We're home. They're invoking the old Temple Mount. They're invoking Abraham, Mount Moriah, Abraham and Isaac, the Maccabees, the Greeks, the Romans. They're invoking this history. This is our home, and we're back. And you have Israeli troops praying at the Western Wall, which the Israelis now control. You even have celebrity singers and choirs coming out and performing for the troops. This is a big moment that goes way beyond any military conquest. The taking of the Temple Mount by Israel. And it's not just there. Against the Jordanians, the Israelis are able to push them back and conquer quite a bit of that eastern territory, including Jericho. Jordanians are crushed. Morale among the Egyptian army and the Jordanian army may be at a historic low at this point. Speaking of the Egyptian army, Israeli forces have been able to push their way all the way almost by the end of June 7th to the Suez Canal. They're about 15 miles away from the Suez Canal. They've also pushed their way all the way to Sharm el-Sheikh, so they control the Strait of Tiran, essentially, as well. So by the end of the day, you have Israeli forces almost at the Suez. They're already at Tiran. They've finished mopping up at Gaza. In fact, President Nasser officially surrenders Gaza by the end of the day. They've conquered a bunch of territory at the expense of Jordan, and they've taken the Temple Mount. Well, on day 4, this is June 8th. This is a bloody day. Most of that bloodshed here on the Sinai Peninsula. As Israeli troops try to take the Suez, as Egyptian troops try to protect it, it's a bloodbath. Just in this day, something like 10,000 Egyptian troops are killed. A bunch of them are left stranded in the desert with no supplies. And this is not a place where you want to be stranded in the desert with no supplies. But yeah, 10,000 or so killed, another 3,000 or so captured by the Israeli Defense Forces, hundreds more tanks destroyed. It's really a rout. Although the Israelis also suffer heavy casualties, just not in proportion to what the Egyptians suffer. And it's so bad that by the end of the day, by about 9:30 at night, the Egyptian president is forced to agree to a ceasefire in the Sinai.
Efforts toward a ceasefire continue at the United Nations. U.S. Ambassador Arthur Goldberg introduces the peace plan. An immediate debate is started in the Security Council representing 15 nations. While the United States and Russia disagree on the wording of the resolution over troop withdrawal, Israel's Foreign Minister Abba Eban charges UAR President Nasser plotted the murder of a state. The vote is finally taken and the resolution adopted unanimously. Word continues to come from the battle zone, telling of sweeping Israeli victories. Next day, Egypt accepts the UN ceasefire, joining Jordan. This left Syria facing Israeli forces alone.
Well, June 9th and June 10th, days 5 and 6 of the Six-Day War, dominated by fighting in the north by the Israeli conquest of the Golan Heights from Syria. Israeli defense forces are buoyed up by reinforcements from the Jordanian front, which has been pacified, West Bank, and from the south, from the Egyptian front, the Sinai and whatnot. These guys rush up and join Israeli forces that are already there in the north. And on the 9th and into the 10th, the Israelis are conquering. This is hard-fought territory. The Syrians able to lay down a blistering artillery barrage. But at the end of the day, by about 6:30 p.m. on June 10th, the Syrians are suing for peace, and there is a ceasefire. So in 6 days, the Israelis, completely surrounded by Arab countries hostile to the state of Israel, with their troops amassed along the border of the state of Israel, the Israelis able to not only defeat them all, acting in concert, but gain critical territory, and quite a bit of it, on all fronts. That critical territory: the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. It's pretty amazing how a technically localized conflict like the Six-Day War, and one that took only 6 days, should have such oversized consequences for regional and world history. Of course, for the Arabs of the former British Mandate of Palestine, the war meant hundreds of thousands more displacements, more ejections. And if you project out beyond the war, years, decades, right to the present, that displacement continues. I think the count right now is something like 1.4 million. 1.4 million, and that's before the Gaza war. For the Jews in the various Arab countries, we see something similar. A process that's been ongoing since 1948, namely the process of the depletion of the Jewish populations in these Arab countries, where in many cases they'd been living for millennia. Thousands of Jews were forced to flee Syria in 1947. Tens of thousands fled Egypt in 48 and 49. Tens of thousands fled Yemen. Thousands fled Lebanon. Thousands more fled Syria. Thousands fled Iran. And then between 1950 and 51, 120,000 Jews were forced out of Iraq. Then during the Suez crisis, another 25,000 Jews were expelled by Nasser from Egypt, followed by 10,000 more the next year. And one of the fruits of the Six-Day War is that Egypt is practically devoid of Jews by the end of the year. They'd been here for thousands of years. And I was just in the ruins of one of their temples in the far south on Elephantine Island just a few days ago. That was a Jewish temple that was 2,600 years old. By the end of 1967, though, virtually no Jews in Egypt anymore. So just as the process of Palestinian Arab displacement will continue over the next few decades, so too the process of Jewish displacement in Syria, in Iran, in Lebanon, elsewhere, will continue. Now, the Six-Day War seemed to demonstrate that little Israel could hold its own, even against the combined might of its many enemies. And not just by squeaking out a win, but via straight-up domination. See, that changes things geopolitically in the region. Domination tends to leave a mark in the form of bitterness and resentment on the part of the war's losers. Those are very dangerous feelings in a political context. When those feelings seep into politics, watch out. We also see an uptick in Zionism. There's a Zionist surge. People are immigrating to Israel after the Six-Day War, feeling proudly Jewish. We see an uptick in the power of the Jewish lobby, the Zionist lobby in the United States, which will have major repercussions for American politics and world history in some ways. You see Jews in large numbers from other countries, particularly from Russia, where of course they have to get permission from the Soviet state just to get out. Eventually the Soviets are going to allow something like 300,000 Jews to immigrate out to Israel. A lot of these migrants, particularly from America, end up migrating back to America after a few years or elsewhere. But still, there's an excitement in the air, less of an air of fear and fearful anticipation than had existed before. And of course, the Israeli economy is going to benefit from this influx of immigrants, influx of tourists in the wake of the war. In a Cold War context, the Soviet bloc withholds recognition of Israel, helped by the fact that the Arab countries fighting Israel tended to lean toward Moscow. While on the US side, more and more, the Americans are seen as aligned with Israel. So if you want to understand the roots of, America's war on terrorism, you have to go back to this period at least, as the US is beginning to be seen as the great funder, the great facilitator of Israel, which, from many Muslim Arabs' point of view, should not exist, was imposed upon the Muslim world, and has now grown at the territorial cost of its Arab neighbors, all with the support of the United States. And especially over the next few years, I mean, the Arabs are going to try in 1973 to win that territory back. And again, the U.S. will be seen as supporting Israel, stymieing that effort. So all of this plays into the image of the Americans as aligned with hated Israel. And when you look at like the Bin Laden letters, his grievances against the USA, as with countless others, these are the types of things that are mentioned. The plight of the Palestinians, mentioned. America's support for Israel, mentioned. Central. This is really, really important stuff for a lot of people. So a process has begun here that will lead to all sorts of trouble on the international stage. I mean, think of the questions that this war now has placed on that stage to be debated at the UN, debated by various countries. You have the question, of course, of the Palestinians, who are now seeking their own state. You have the question of Jerusalem, what's to be its fate. You have the question of the Sinai Peninsula. We'll see in 1978, the Sinai is actually handed back to Egypt, thanks to the Camp David Accords, but what about the rest? What about Gaza? Militarily occupied Gaza. The militarily occupied West Bank. Another consequence of the war, for the first time, in some cases for centuries, Jews have access to specific holy sites. They've been denied before. And I'm not just talking about the Temple Mount, where they can now pray. Obviously, Al-Aqsa Mosque is there, but now they have access to at least pray there. But there are other sites that they've been barred from, and now they have access. So this is a big deal for them. By the end of these 6 days, the map of the Middle East has been redrawn. A new power has emerged. New objects of hatred and division have emerged on both sides. Bitterness, resentment, distrust has arisen on both sides. We see this idea after the 6-day war emerge of an Israel that cannot be defeated in open battle. This seems to have been demonstrated in great power by the war. So you have outfits like the PLA operating under the assumption that the only way to free the Arabs, to free the Palestinians, to rid the region of Israel, which of course is the whole point, is through terrorism. So we see an uptick in bombings and kidnappings and murders and things like that. The idea being to terrorize Israel into submission. And the Muslim world, the Islamic world, they're watching these events. All across the Islamic world, they're watching these events. And of course, sympathizing with the Palestinians, hating Israel more, and by extension, hating the United States, which is seen more and more as allied with Israel. So all of this is going to have huge ramifications for the United States, for Americans, for the Western world in general, for the relationship between the West and the Islamic world, for the various struggles in which Muslims are engaged all over the world, for which the Palestinian struggle is like a laboratory. It all reverberates right into the present. So by the time the last shots of the 6-day war had been fired, the world had changed. And some of the great geopolitical questions of the next several decades had been born. Thank you so much for watching to the end. I really appreciate that. If you want me to keep creating content like this, consider becoming my patron over on patreon.com. Also follow me on Instagram, where weekly I issue updates as well as a set of history challenges, a little more engagement there. It's a lot of fun. We'll see you there.